You ever play a video game and think to yourself, man, I'm having a really good time, but I wish I wasn't pushing buttons right now? Video game adaptations. In just 2023 alone, we've seen quite a few films and shows based on recognizable video game franchises, and some of them are pretty heavy hitters. In a year where the MCU's reputation has only continued to plummet, and with Hollywood still afraid to greenlight any project that isn't a sequel or remake of an already existing franchise, among other awful things that we will talk about, it seems that video games are likely to become the next big trend. One, dare I say, with the potential to overtake comic book films, and I'm not even exaggerating. Things have seemingly changed a lot in just the last few years. I mean, it was only a few months ago with the release of The Last of Us on HBO Max that I was still hearing people talk about the infamous video game curse, and wondering if this new show would finally be the one to break it. In my humble opinion, the curse has already been broken for a long time, and with it lifted, open is the Pandora's box that has ushered in a new era of video game-based films and shows. For better or worse. And that's what I'm interested in exploring today. The ins and outs of video games, their relationship with the small and silver screen, and the conflicted emotions I feel as a result of this new trend. What does this current era look like? When was the curse lifted exactly? And what can we expect to see in the future? Hi, I'm Lady Zillennial, certified gamer, spelled with a Y, and I have an utterly useless film degree. So let's talk about Okay, for as much as I like to poke fun at people who bring up the video game curse unironically in this day and age, this idea didn't come out of nowhere. There was in fact a time when video game-based movies and some shows were laughingstocks that bore little or no resemblance to the original source material. On a technicality, the very first video game adaptation into film was Super Mario Bros. The Great Mission to Rescue Princess Peach, an animated film released in Japan in 1986, which was just 1 year after the very first game in the Super Mario Bros. Series had released, and is kind of an exception to the rule of adaptations being not good. Instead we get, it's cute I guess. Okay, if you want to get technical, this film released the same day as another anime film based on a video game, that being Running Boy Star Soldier Secret, but given that I just had an aneurysm saying the titles for both of these films, I'm just gonna go ahead and simplify things and say that the Mario movie was first. This film didn't dazzle my socks or anything. In fact, I think it was kind of boring at times, but for a film that literally only had this to work with, I'd say this is a pretty faithful adaptation of the source material. It feels surprisingly in line with our modern day understanding of Mario. Hell, Bowser looks more on model here than he does in official Mario games. It's kinda nuts. Though to compensate, Luigi is blue, and that's just cursed. The film is fascinating for its historical value, especially when you consider its Japan exclusivity and the fact that a majority of my audience probably either hasn't seen it or had no idea it existed in the first place. For a while, it was even considered lost media. What I'm showing on screen now is a restoration that looks pretty damn good. Now we can look at these toads in all of their 4K glory. But hey, I live in America, and I want to watch something that was made for me.
With the Mario Brothers and plumbing's a game. We're not like the others who get all the fame. If your sink is in trouble, you can call us on the double. We're faster than the others, you'll be hooked on the brothers.
Oh yeah, this right here is as American as cheeseburgers and apple pies, baby. The Super Mario Bros. Super Show, in keeping with our theme of Mr. Plumber Guy, is a TV show that combines live-action sketches with some original animated material. Releasing 3 years after the film that we just discussed, the show had a bit more source material to work with, though not much in the grand scheme of things. The hybrid format is cool and unique, but the show is pretty average in a lot of ways. The live-action sketches have their charm and can be funny from time to time, but the animated segments felt like every other Saturday morning cartoon from the 80s, which is what you could also say about the Zelda cartoon that would always get promoted at the end of each episode of this show. Yeah, Mario's gotten quite a few adaptations over the years, but Zelda? Well, this exists. And I don't know what else there really is to say. In fact, I might have more to say in a future video, so In 1991, the very first live-action video game movie was released. That movie being Super Mario Bros. This right here is the blueprint that every live-action video game film for the next couple of decades would follow. Maybe not to a T, but this set a precedent. And once you do that, well, you get this. This film is infamous for being weird, and not good. If you were hoping for something accurate to the world and characters found in the Super Mario Bros. Games, yeah, this ain't it, Chief. But if you were hoping to see Mario get a face full of titties, well, you could do a lot worse than this. A lot has been said about the film's troubled production that was allegedly so incredibly awful that Bob Hoskins, Mario himself, literally showed up to set drunk. Nobody was having a good time making this thing, and it confused the hell out of its target demographic. The film pays lip service to many iconic Mario items and characters, but is fundamentally like watching an avant-garde Blade Runner knockoff. Super Mario Bros., Blade Runner, and Jurassic Park are three things that I did not expect to be shoved together. But yeah, that's basically what this movie is. It's definitely a unique approach to an adaptation. I will give it that. But ignoring how awful it is from the perspective of faithfully adapting the source material, it doesn't exactly stand alone as a good film either. It's bad enough that it actually veers into so bad that it's good territory. And honestly, that's a lot better than if it were just bland and forgettable. I find a lot of joy in experiencing this one, which I sadly cannot say for the films that came in the decades that followed. So 8 and 16-bit consoles definitely had their fair share of story-driven games, but the scope of what video games could achieve was undoubtedly limited by the hardware constraints of the time. With this in mind, Adaptations could have served as a great way to flesh out the worlds, characters, and storylines of the games. Some adaptations in the 90s definitely tried to do this, but a lot of them just kind of did their own thing, which isn't inherently bad, but almost none of these adaptations were able to stand on their own. The quality ranged from booty to decent but forgettable to what the fuck. Street Fighter is an example of a film that's on the side of it's not great, but it's a fun watch. Mortal Kombat, however, no, this was just a mess. A PG-13 adaptation of a game franchise that was partially responsible for the creation of the ESRB. You know, the American ratings board that slaps an M-rated game when it's got too much blood or titty. Hey, speaking of titty, Tomb Raider also got a movie. A goofy, silly little movie that's buried under a mountain of cheese. As though your waiter at Olive Garden asked you to say stop when you had enough, and you just never did. Cheese. Speaking of channel-specific references that evoke certain videos that I made about a certain zombie franchise, Resident Evil. Yeah, this one's interesting. The film makes a few weird decisions, like focusing on characters that aren't the ones we're familiar with from the games, and its second half is pretty weak overall. But the first half is quite solid as far as being a horror experience that builds up tension, making it probably one of, if not the best live-action video game movie for a decent stretch of time. I assume at least. I honestly haven't seen all of them, but yeah, these scores don't give me a lot of hope. We got a spooky mansion, we've got Umbrella, and we got Zombos. It's pretty camp, especially the further on it goes, but that's just being accurate to the source material, which itself was incredibly campy. Funnily enough, the games would actually go on to take inspiration from the films. In other words, they became batshit insane. Resident Evil would go on to spawn a shit ton of sequels, making it an ever-present force in the video game adaptation landscape, with the films in this series degrading further in quality as they went along. Though, none of those compare to the awfulness that is The House of the Dead. Oh boy. So if you're a longtime viewer on my channel, you'll know that The House of the Dead is a series that I simp hard for, and I look for any excuse that I can to talk about it. And this film makes me regret that. Directed by Uwe Boll, who we will talk about, this is about as baffling of an adaptation as you could possibly get. The plot has next to nothing in common with the game it's adapting, aside from the fact that there are zombies. The game's story is about two secret agents going to a mansion to stop an evil scientist who's unleashing creatures that are terrorizing the lovely employees that are part of this secret facility hiding within a mansion. Yes, I'm aware it's quite similar to Resident Evil in a lot of ways, down to sharing a release here. That being said, the Resident Evil movie would make a better House of the Dead film than the one that it actually got. And that is depressing. Instead, we get to see a bunch of drunk 20 and 30-year-olds get slaughtered in a very uninteresting way, with gameplay randomly shoved in as a way to transition scenes. Hold on. What? This is baffling enough in and of itself, but what really rustles my jimmies is the casual use of House of the Dead 2 mixed in with the first game, even though this film is titled The House of the Dead, implying that it's supposed to just be adapting the first game. And what rustles my jimmies even further is the fact that they use green blood. Now look, I'm kinda nostalgic for the green blood, but why? In your official House of the Dead movie, would you show green blood? That would be like making a PG-13 Mortal Kombat. Okay, this is the part where we talk about the man, the myth, the legend, Uwe Boll. The man who single-handedly stifled innovation in the video game film adaptation landscape, and that's not even hyperbole. The man has directed a plethora of video game-based films, including adaptations of Blood Rain, Alone in the Dark, Postal, Far Cry, and the list keeps going. These films are all dog shit, and there's a very specific reason for that. German tax law. Mr. Boll intentionally sabotaged these films to exploit a German tax loophole that allowed for revenue lost on films to be used as a tax write-off. This isn't even speculation. Boll literally confessed to it, so like, the man's got no shame, and I can almost respect that. These were not movies, they were lies. Boll was far from the only director making awful video game adaptations, but he wasn't exactly doing the concept any favors. Fortunately, that loophole no longer exists, and since then, Boll has gone back to making normal shitty movies. He's cooking up a few other projects as we speak, and honestly, good for him. As long as he stays in that lane and doesn't leave it. At least we can safely ignore him. Ignoring Uwe Boll's filmography, the 2000s and early 2010s saw even more bad or mediocre film adaptations like Doom, Max Payne, and Hitman. All of these films failed for different reasons, but as time went on, the stigma around these adaptations continued to grow, to such a point that many argued that the mere idea of trying to adapt video games in the first place was simply ludicrous. By the time we got to the 7th console gen, games were taking on a far more cinematic identity. Uncharted, Mass Effect, The Last of Us, Telltale's The Walking Dead, and so many more proved that video games could do almost anything that films could do, but with an added interactive layer. At a certain point, did these games even need to be adapted? After all, the mediums of film and video games, for as similar as they are also very different. And if the game is good, ideally it's good in part because it leans into the strengths that its medium allows for. With games looking better and more cinematic, what would even be the point? I want you to keep this all in your mind because it's going to become a lot more relevant to the main discussion that I want to have. But for now, yeah, video game movies were very consistently bad. And even the best ones like Resident Evil aren't exactly films that I would say are anything more than a, yeah, that was pretty fun. But I think our scope here is a bit too narrow. The mid to late 2010s are roughly the period of time where we started to gradually see that quality shift, at least when it came to theatrically released films. Or did we? After all, at the very beginning, we talked about a bunch of animated stuff and, would you look at that? There's actually a metric shit ton of adaptations that open up when you remember that shows and animation exist. So let's talk about it. When you think of animated adaptations of popular video game franchises, it's almost impossible to not immediately think of Pokemon, which is fair, since alongside the games, Pokemon as a multimedia franchise is like the biggest thing ever, much to the detriment of the most recent and upcoming games. Ugh. The Pokemon anime is about as classic as it gets, often overshadowing the games in terms of nostalgia for a lot of the more casual Pokemon fans. And it was certainly my gateway into the Pokemon franchise when I was younger. For the longest time, Pokemon as a game series was relegated to Nintendo's handhelds, which were notoriously far less powerful than the home consoles available at the time, which meant that players had to use their imagination a lot more when it came to envisioning the Pokemon world. And hey, that's fun and all, but sometimes you want to see a chunky mouse electrocute birds on your TV as God intended. The Pokemon anime isn't exactly the pinnacle of storytelling or anything. A lot of the show was very episodic and formulaic, but there was some semblance of an overarching story with an end goal, and the Pokemon anime is notable for spawning a movie. And then a metric fuckload more. Far too many for me to even fathom talking about. And I'm sure some of these are pretty good, but I really don't want to watch or talk about these right now. However, I will give credit to the film Pokemon Lucario and the Mystery of Mew for being my awakening as a child. And that's all I'm gonna say about that. Actually, this particular movie is interesting because if I recall correctly, it introduced Lucario before it was ever introduced in the games, which is a thought that just produced a pin that will be revisited momentarily. We already touched on the Mario and Zelda cartoons, but I'd be remiss to not mention things like 1989's Captain N, the Game Master, 1993's Sonic the Hedgehog, and the show that you probably had no idea existed, 1996's Mortal Kombat, Defenders of the Realm, which is an animated Mortal Kombat show meant for kids. Speaking of kids, for kids, the infamous anime dubbing company who produced the English localization of Pokemon, among other things, also had their grubby little hands all over other anime video game adaptations like Kirby Right Back Atcha, F-Zero GP Legends, and of course, Sonic X. None of these shows lit the world on fire exactly, but to varying degrees, they were pretty fun shows that came up with original stories and were sometimes fairly accurate to the games. But accuracy doesn't always translate to greatness. This now brings us to a different side of anime adaptations. The ones that, on the surface, are very accurate translations of the games being adapted, but which fail to properly convert that story into its target medium. Shows which come to mind are Ace Attorney, Danganronpa the animation, and Personas 4 and 5 the animation. These shows are practically one-to-one with the plots from the games, but that presents a problem, which leads to a paradox. Who are these shows for, is the question that comes to mind. If you're a fan of these games, you might get a kick out of seeing some of your favorite moments being brought to life in an animated format, but is that enough to justify sitting through a full 26 episode season? For some, maybe, but I'm in the camp that would say it's just not worth it. Because undoubtedly, the experience would end up being a stripped down shell that lacks many of the components that defined the experience when it was played as a game. Are these shows meant for people who have never played the games but still want to experience the story? Well, maybe, but if this is how you experience these games for the first time, you're ultimately getting something that's heavily watered down and cut for time. Persona 5 alone is a roughly 100-hour experience, and condensing that into a roughly 10-hour runtime across a season of television that's broken up by 23-minute chunks means that inevitably, a lot of stuff is gonna get cut. Yes, the game is long as hell, and there's probably a decent amount of fluff in there, but the experience is long for a reason. It's a role-playing experience that lets you simulate the experience of having friends, and the development that these characters get is built up over the course of dozens and dozens of hours. Hot take, but Personas 4 and 5 don't exactly have amazing stories. They're fine, but nothing mind-blowing. To me, it's the combination of player input and the time spent interacting with these characters that makes me care about them more. There's a reason these exist as video games. Even something like Danganronpa, a visual novel with arguably very little in terms of gameplay, is still an experience that I would recommend playing, or watching someone else play, over watching the animation. So we have adaptations that are way too accurate, and we have others that aren't nearly accurate enough. So it seems like a truly good adaptation would strike a good middle ground. But before we talk about the adaptations that properly fit this mold, I have a quick little detour that I'd like to take you on. Hey, this video doesn't have a sponsor, but I do have a Patreon, and I would very much like to make YouTube a full-time job, so if you would like to help me make that happen, I got a Patreon linked in the description below. You'll get all kinds of cool stuff. Alright, on to the next section of the video. Since I was just talking about Danganronpa and how not great the anime adaptation is, I'd like to talk about a different anime, Danganronpa 3, the third entry in the Danganronpa series of games. Wait, what? Danganronpa is a trilogy of games, but actually, if you only play these 3 games, you're gonna be very confused. This show, which is actually 2 shows, man, what the fuck, is the direct follow-up to the second game. And that's incredibly interesting. When you think video game-based movies or shows, you hardly ever think of media that continues the story and is actually canon to the events of the game. And that's cool, but at the same time, I have mixed feelings about this. Other examples of game franchises that have done this include Resident Evil, because of course, Professor Layton, the Dot Hack franchise, and if you really want to get technical, allegedly Kingdom Hearts 3 is canon to Big Hero 6. I don't know about that one. Obligatory Wreck-It Ralph reference, Mario, Sonic, House of the Dead, and a bunch of other franchises are canon to the Wreck-It Ralph universe, and Wreck-It Ralph, if I recall, shows up in Kingdom Hearts 3, and Sora appeared in Super Smash Bros. My brain is fried. So basically, these are all stories that are canon to the games, whether it be continuation or something that provides more lore or fills in gaps and provides context for things. Thank you, by the way, to everyone who commented on my community post. You're all awesome. I appreciate all of you. Thank you. On one hand, the continuation approach means that these shows have something worthwhile to offer, and it allows for stories to be told that maybe wouldn't work so well in a video game format. On the other, it can create a barrier to entry that can make these films and shows feel a bit more messy and convoluted, as if some of these series didn't already do enough of that on their own when they were just games. If you haven't already played the games, you're gonna miss out on some important context. So understandably, the most popular style of adaptation that we see is, well, an adaptation. And I think it's time that we talk about the good shit. Okay, last tangent, I swear, but Across the Spider-Verse has been out for a hot little minute, okay? And a PS4 Spider-Man, he shows up in the movie and he knows he's in a video game, and I guess that technically makes Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse a video game adaptation in a way that For a good 3-ish decade span, video game adaptations ranged from bad to decent. But around the mid to late 2010s, the bar was pushed further and further into the pretty good territory. And from my perspective, this new era kind of officially sort of kicked off with Angry Birds. Yes, really. Hey, it's based on a mobile game, and that still counts. It's really easy to forget about this one these days, which goes to show just how much of a lasting impact this film had. But hey, for as mediocre or just outright not good as it can be in places, the overall package is surprisingly competent. The film didn't have much to work with as far as source material was concerned. I don't know, throw some birds at some boxes or some shit. That's all the movie really needed to do to be accurate. And hey, we got that. Outside of this one set piece, the film kinda just had to make shit up. And I think this freedom is exactly the thing that allowed this film to be alright. I mean, we still have one of the birds drinking piss water, which, as far as I recall, I don't think that's canon to the games. Bad movie, bad. A month earlier, the Ratchet and Clank movie came out. Yeah, 2016 was a year that I like to forget happened too. This film was nicely animated, but supremely mediocre. But mediocre is still kind of a step in the right direction. Really, it's Angry Birds that genuinely surprised a lot of people with how not mediocre it was. This film was a turning point. It actually started to give me a little bit of hope. And so I waited patiently for something to reach the quality of 2012's Wreck-It Ralph. And I'll be honest with you, this film to this day still clears any video game related movie that I've ever seen, so I won't keep you in suspense there. But if you average out its quality with its sequel, then okay. That's a little more fair. I apologize for reminding you that this movie exists. However, if we're looking at TV shows, 2017 brought something truly special. Netflix's Castlevania. Holy shit, dude. Wait, why is it only 4 episodes? Well, who cares? This first season was short, but it went hard, giving us an adaptation that finally struck the ideal balance between telling the story of the games and doing something new. Then season 2 came out a year later and was even better, making this what I consider to be the first truly great video game adaptation. Look at this. Speaking of 2018, Tomb Raider is a movie you probably forgot about, but I'm here to tell you, it's kinda decent. Above average, I'd say. It certainly didn't leave much of a lasting impact on me, though I would probably say the same for the 2013 game, but the contrast between this and the previous film iteration is quite noticeable. And then 2019 came along and brought Detective Pikachu, the very first live-action Pokemon film, and it was okay. I quite enjoyed this movie in the moment, though I admit it didn't leave much of a lasting impact on me. But hey, the film could have turned out a lot worse. It was clear that the average quality of these projects was going up drastically. So what else did 2019 give us? Oh no. Well, you gotta give this whole situation some credit, because this is probably one of the greatest comeback stories in all of video game adaptation history. Everything leading up to the Sonic movie's release kinda seemed like a death blow. Mediocre jokes in the trailer, Sonic being in the real world with James Marsden, and above all, this disgusting design.
Wait a minute! Who are you?
So what happened next? People bitched, as they do, but they bitched so loud and hard that Paramount delayed the film to 2020 so that they could fix Sonic's design. And, oh, this actually looks really good. And the film is out and, it's pretty decent. Kinda similar in quality to Detective Pikachu. Alright, movie, good job. And then nothing else of note happened in 2020. But past this point are a group of adaptations that collectively are the best that we've ever seen. Not you, or you. Okay, can I just talk about my beef with this one real quick? You took a game that was meant to be the video game version of Indiana Jones, and then you made a movie based off of that and picked actors that weren't suited to the role just to make a watered down Indiana Jones-esque type of movie. This movie was in production hell for a very long time, and it was just destined to not be very good. But that's all I'm gonna say about it. Mortal Kombat with an R rating, Arcane with its incredible animation and writing, Cuphead as well, another Sonic movie, this one being even better than the first, The Last of Us, and most recently of all, the Super Mario Bros. Movie. Each of these work to varying degrees, but they also all work for very different reasons. Arcane is simply one of the best here, and this is coming from someone who has never had any interest in playing League of Legends. From my understanding, League's lore isn't something that you really experience while playing the game, and is instead fleshed out through supplementary material. Arcane takes some of these characters and stories and weaves them into an incredibly focused and tightly written television experience. This, Castlevania, and Cyberpunk Edgerunners show just how well suited TV and animation are for adapting these games. Animation allows you to do pretty much anything you want and create stunning worlds that would be harder to pull off with a TV budget in a live action setting. And the TV format allows a story to be paced as long as it needs to be. With a film, you only get about 90 to 180 minutes max to adapt the source material, which is peanuts when the average AAA game can range from 8 to 100 hours long. So the most ideal and economical choice is to either tell a new story using the characters and general world beats, or make a TV show instead. Arcane is great, but one of the main reasons as to why it's so great is because the source material allowed for more flexibility than most other adaptations. We then look to something like Cyberpunk Edgerunners, which tells an original story set in the same world as the games, only with a distinct lack of Keanu Chungus Reeves. But what if we adapted something already story-driven and cinematic? And what if we made it live action? In January of 2023, we got the premiere of HBO's The Last of Us, and the Mad Lads did it. Not only do I think this is the best video game adaptation ever made, at least as far as live action stuff is concerned, but I actually prefer this to the game that it's adapting. And that's a bold statement, but yeah, I said it. I enjoyed the 2013 game quite a bit, but to be honest, I thought it was a little overrated. At its core was the typical reluctant father figure going on an adventure with a child that he didn't ask for, but grows to love kind of story, which has only become more of a trope with time. And look, it's a fun trope. I like it quite a bit, but at least on the surface, the plot was pretty simple. The characters and their dynamics were the key to this experience. Joel and Ellie's relationship was at the core of what made this story work as well as it did, combined with an ending which left a huge impact and is still heavily discussed to this day. Some of those conversations being reignited thanks to the release of the HBO series. I thought the gameplay itself was okay, and overall, I still enjoyed The Last of Us back in 2013. I just didn't love it at the same level that I feel like a lot of other people did. But I was still very much interested in seeing what the show had in store, especially with Neil Druckmann and Chernobyl's Craig Mazin behind the wheel. And while I do have complaints and nitpicks, I think HBO's The Last of Us did everything I could have realistically hoped for. The show is an incredibly faithful adaptation of the game, and yet it also makes changes and concessions where necessary. A few overcorrections aside, the show strikes the ideal balance between preserving the original experience and changing things enough to suit the new format. The changes which have been made are exactly the thing that rounds out this experience for me and elevates it to a whole new level. With time, some of the flaws of the original The Last of Us have become more apparent, and the show, being another attempt to tell the story 10 years later, is the perfect chance to address those criticisms and improve on certain things. The standout, easily, was what the show did with the characters of Bill and Frank, who, even if not intentionally, were unfortunately victims of the bury your gaze trope. And by reworking the story in a way that's both more respectful to the characters, as well as capitalizing on the ability to switch perspectives more easily than would be possible in a game, the result is one of the most critically acclaimed episodes of television. One which added a lot to the story and helped me to understand what The Last of Us is really all about. I knew exactly where the story was headed a majority of the time while watching this series, but even when that was the case, I appreciated things like getting to spend more time in the pre-outbreak world, or getting to see Jackson, which only appeared in the second game, but now with hindsight gets to be worked into this story, or even just appreciating the different performances and interpretations of these characters. Pedro Pascal as Joel and Bella Ramsey as Ellie had a lot in common with their game counterparts, but brought their own unique flavors to the characters. It helps that neither of them actually played the game prior to working on this show, so there was no temptation to imitate what the game already did. Sure, I think they may have overcorrected a tad with the lack of infected, but I appreciated the story's restraint with them. Every time an infected does appear, there are consequences, and it makes them feel far more dangerous, unlike the game where they're just sometimes a mild nuisance meant to give the player something to do. The Last of Us is a show about people and their relationships. It's a show about love and how beautiful that love can be, but also the dangerous paths that we can go down because of that love. It's more than just a bleak post-apocalyptic road trip. There's a lot more to The Last of Us, and the show helped me to appreciate it a lot more. I enjoyed the hell out of this series, and I'm incredibly excited to see how they go about adapting the second game, because look, I know how controversial this thing is, and I will admit, it is very flawed, but I think the core story it tried to tell was still worth telling, and it made a lot of sense narratively. The sequel made some bold decisions, which, while controversial, I can respect a lot. Many hated this game for all the wrong reasons, but while they were drowned out, there were genuine criticisms, and I think the show will allow this story to get a second chance. And while I am excited about that prospect, it does make me a little sad to know that it's going to end up missing out on a few key benefits that are present to the game's storytelling methods. I was a bit miffed when Craig Mazin said that The Last of Us had, quote, the greatest video game story ever told, because there are certainly better stories out there in gaming, and even more that utilize the medium of video games to their fullest potential as part of their story. I would actually argue that a game which has the greatest video game story ever told would inherently be a terrible choice for a film or TV adaptation, because that would mean sacrificing the game-centric elements that we would assume this story to have. While far from perfect in and of itself, the sequel does a better job than the first, I think, at utilizing the medium of video games to do things that wouldn't work quite as well in a TV format. And without getting too deep into spoilers, because I know some people have only watched the show and not played the game, being forced to play as a character that you've been taught to hate is a really bold move. This surprised a lot of players and left everybody with a profound and somewhat uncomfortable feeling that made this game unlike most others. But that feeling will certainly lose its impact if translated directly to the TV format, since you're not the one controlling these characters anymore. Video games have a very unique power to make you feel empathy towards the characters that you are inhabiting and controlling. But hey, whatever happens, I'm still really interested in seeing what they do next, and I'm glad that people who don't play video games were still able to enjoy the story of The Last of Us. Having a TV show is a much better alternative to just watching the cutscenes on YouTube, since those were never designed to be experienced out of context. All in all, I really enjoyed my delightfully depressing time in this fungus-filled world. Hey, speaking of fungus, the Super Mario Bros. Movie. That's really what they called it. So look, I'm quite the Mario enjoyer. Alright? I remember when the voice cast was initially announced, and it was confirmed that Illumination was going to be making this movie, and I do recall exactly how the internet reacted.
Yo!
It wasn't good, but still, I held out some semblance of hope. The choice was a bit confusing, but it didn't tarnish anything in my eyes. I had a gut feeling that the film was going to be alright, and would perform quite well at the box office. Sure enough, with each new trailer, the discourse started to shift, and it continued to do so. And then the movie came out, and I watched it for myself, and it was fine. This is probably one of, if not the best film in Illumination's catalog, but the standards are Illumination, the Minion people. Though I guess Mario's no stranger to collaborations with Minion-esque beings. Like if I had a nickel for every time that happens, I'd only have 2 nickels, but it's kind of strange that it happened twice. In terms of accuracy to the source material, and just the sheer amount of references being made, this blows the live action film out of the water. It truly feels like I'm being taken on a tour of the Mushroom Kingdom, but that's kind of the problem. The music is great, aside from when they use licensed music. The voice acting is fine, the visuals are pleasing to look at, but the story is rather shallow, and the result is a film that feels like an amusement park ride. Hey look, it's an ad for Super Nintendo World at Universal Studios Hollywood. The games have historically had shallow and basic storylines, with the only exceptions being one-off side stories. Seriously, why does Rosalina's storybook go so hard? Or spin-offs like Mario and Luigi or the Paper Mario games. And hey, if you watch this video and you like Paper Mario, I'm kind of in the middle of a big Paper Mario retrospective thing, so you should watch those. Mario has such a confusing continuity, with my headcanon being that there are at least 50 or so Mario universes or timelines. Yes, this will probably be its own video someday, but yeah, it's a mess. There are well over 200 official Mario games, probably closer to 300 at this point. I don't know, I haven't been keeping track. Point is, each game is meant to be a good starting point, and the focus is always on the gameplay, which is meant to be accessible, unlike the movie, because this will confuse your grandma, and it would absolutely send a Victorian-era child into paralysis. The film just kind of says, yeah, mushrooms, they make you big. Monkey, they talk. Brick blocks, they float now. As an esteemed Mario fan myself, I understand how things work, but not everybody who's seen this thing has even touched an Xbox, okay? This film is just a bunch of bright lights and references and a few cute and funny moments. And it's not especially great, but I didn't exactly care, because I had a good-ass time in the theater. Yeah, I know, they were just jangling keys in my face, but like, the keys were pretty. What am I supposed to do? If a different animation studio were granted the license to make this movie, this more than likely could have been a much better film, but like, would that really matter? Mario is Mr. Video Game Guy. I don't expect his movies to be anything more than, yeah, it's cute. And as long as you keep your expectations in check, this is a good time. And the sequel? Well, they're probably gonna make a sequel, huh? I mean, have you seen these numbers? Dear Lord! Well, this brings us to our final topic. With the Mario movie absolutely destroying at the box office, I have no doubt that studios are taking note, and what's likely to follow will be even more attempts at bringing some of the most lucrative gaming IPs to the big screen. Oh yeah, can't wait until we get that Amogus movie, baby. This is both really exciting, but also very frustrating. Look, nothing exists in a vacuum, and it's difficult to look at the current state of the business end of Hollywood and not feel incredibly disheartened and exhausted. These big corporations are quite literally preventing creatives from being able to make a decent living and tell their stories. The WGA and SAG-AFTRA are on strike right now because writers and actors are getting severely fucked over. And it's bad. Writers are having their contracts shortened, loopholes exploited to get free labor out of them, and most are literally fighting for survival. In fact, many writers spend more time worrying about landing their next gig than they spend actually working on shows and films. It's not a sustainable career. The studios that hire these actors and writers could very easily fix these issues if they cared, but the executives at the top don't care because all they want to do is cut costs and maintain this nebulous idea of growth to appease shareholders. With all that's happening right now and everything that's come out about the way these studios treat all of the people that make their shit, it should be very apparent that I stand in support and in solidarity with the strikes, inside and outside the film industry. No, seriously, I feel like every industry needs to go on strike. Unions are good, and if you disagree, you're a ding-dong. The next few years are very likely going to be heavily impacted by these strikes, and as such, I'm sure that the quality of a lot of stuff choosing to continue production right now will suffer. But I'm okay with sacrificing some shows and movies if it means that the people who tell the stories that have meant so much to me over the years, and who will hopefully continue to do so, can afford to live comfortably. In fact, I'm okay with not having anything new to watch for a while because I have a massive backlog of books, movies, shows, and video games to get caught up on. Enough to last me the rest of my life. So, I'm good. But even if that weren't the case, people's livelihoods are more important, and I hope that these strikes accomplish what they seek to achieve so that writers, actors, and just everybody who works in any capacity on these projects can stop worrying about putting food on the table and just focus on being creative and telling stories. So with all that being said, I had placed some pins throughout the video. I think it's time to pick them up and finish this discussion. So one of the consequences of the business side of Hollywood striving for constant growth is the fact that studios these days almost never greenlight original films. And I'm specifically talking about big theatrically released stuff. We do have smaller studios making original films, yes, I will acknowledge that. But without fail, the highest grossing theatrically released films of the last few years have been sequels, remakes, reboots, adaptations, or basically just anything with a name that people recognize from somewhere else. Superhero movies are starting to lose popularity, but they're still the big thing right now. But I think studios, Disney and Warner Brothers especially, are seeing more and more of these films bomb, so they're gonna try to find the next big thing. More recently, we saw Barbie become quite a success, and now fucking Mattel wants to make a whole ass cinematic universe out of their toys and board games, and it's like, guys, I think you took the wrong message from this film's success. And I think studios are gonna take home the wrong message about the Super Mario Bros. Movie's success. So it all comes full circle. And you combine all that with studios trying to rely on writers as little as possible and just penny pinch wherever they can, even if it means fucking people over. And yes, any shortcut that can be taken will be taken. During the 2007 to 2008 writer's strike, there was a huge surge in cheaply produced reality TV shows that could be made without a writer's room. Today, we're seeing companies turn to things like AI-generated scripts, deep fakes of actors, and more big names that can be easily translated into film and television. Video games seem to be this huge untapped market, and with a lot of them already being very cinematic and story-driven, I imagine studios using these scripts as a blueprint for these adaptations. If you get actual writers in a room, yes, they would be able to use these scripts as a jumping off point for something good, but that's assuming studios can take the money they're using to sabotage the strikes and just use them to pay their damn staff. Everything happening in the industry aside, and assuming we can eventually get things back to some semblance of normalcy, I have mixed feelings about this oncoming era of video game adaptations. On one hand, games are games for a reason. But on the other, there's definitely some potential out there for some really cool new things to be made. The things that we currently have to look forward to are a Five Nights at Freddy's movie that's been in production for a long ass time. We've got sequels to stuff that already currently exists, a few upcoming projects that were announced some time ago, and Nintendo is probably going to go real hard on a lot of adaptations. So originally, my idea for what this video was going to be looked very different. I was actually planning a video about this idea of a Nintendo cinematic universe all culminating in a Super Smash Bros. Film, and why I thought that would be a bad idea, but then Shea Frillis, bless his soul, made verbatim the exact video that I would have made. And also closer to when the Mario movie was actually relevant, so whoops. I mean, I pretty much agree with all of his takes. He pretty much says exactly what I would have said had I been able to make my video, which, to sum it up, is the idea that a Nintendo cinematic universe is a very bad idea and should not be done. But more Nintendo movies could be good, assuming that they choose the right series to adapt and the right people to adapt them. It's just not a good idea to try and force all of these disparate worlds into this cohesive story. Like, maybe you could do a one-off crossover at some point in the future, I guess, as like a fun thing. But don't build this up around the idea of having a continuous story that overlaps. Listen, I don't know how compelling a Rhythm Heaven movie would be, but fuck it, I'll watch it. Metroid is an obvious fit for a movie, and I'd love to see that. But of course, I'm a biased gal, so a Zelda movie. Ooh, that's what I want. There were rumors that Illumination was going to make a Zelda movie, which seems to actually not be true. And I think a lot of us sighed a sigh of relief when that was revealed to be the case. But an animated Zelda film would be cool. But what would it look like? Well, at some point I am planning on making a video that talks about the Legend of Zelda series and breaks down its visual identity. So, if that's something you want to watch, you should hit the subscribe button. Anyway, this has gone on for longer than I hoped it would. So to wrap up, video games can make good movies, but only if the right game is chosen, and only if changes are made to suit the target format. The video game curse has been broken for quite some time now. The future looks interesting. I just hope we don't get video game movie fatigue in 10 years, and writers, actors, basically anybody who works on any of these projects in any capacity deserve to get paid fairly for their work. And once again, unions are good. So that's about all I've got for today. Wait, how could I forget to talk about the Slender movie that came out in 2018? Dude, I was working at a theater when this thing came out. Okay, this video's over.
Swing your arms from side to side. Come.
Special thanks to all my patrons, including Laura Flynn, who gets a verbal shout out for being in my highest currently available tier. My Patreon is in the description below if you'd like to help support me so that I can make YouTube a full-time job. And we also have a link to a Discord server where you can hang out and talk about games, movies, and other fun stuff. I'm Lady Zillennial, and I'll see you next time.